In the darkest shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read ancient tomes, the order of the Abercast. We are the brave and bold.
The Ages begins with the shocking story of Cain and Abel and the journey of violence and revenge spanning thousands of years, following Cain through his cursed life from an ancient invasion of malicious angels to the American Revolutionary War. A masterful, compelling journey through time, The Ages delves deep into arcane knowledge, myth, and legend. The art is stunning, and the story takes you on a journey where mortals, immortals, angels, and demons are all forced to deal with the folly that is God's creation. It's a beautifully dark and gritty ride through history. This 4-part story follows the astrological procession of the ages and how each 2,500-year age parallels major changes in the development of Earth's inhabitants. Cain's blasphemous struggle with the divine and sacred tyrant God will create and crumble empires, shape history, and cause a cosmic cataclysm.
Sejna said he also saw at least 200 U.S. prisoners captured in Vietnam and Laos, transported to the Soviet Union between 1961 and 1968, just before he defected. Some of these soldiers, he said, were given to the Chinese for similar medical experiments. This is from... I believe it's from the Chicago Tribune, September 18th, 1968. The article is called Defector Details Korea POW Atrocities, GIs Reportedly Used in Soviet Experiments. It's by a guy named Bob Kemper. I'm sorry I didn't take note of the newspaper. I don't know why. I usually do. But if you Google search it, I'm sure it'll come up. I'm sure it'll be easy to find. And I'm like 80% sure it's the Chicago Trib. All right, so this is going to be a dark one, guys. Are you ready? Let's get into this. Let's get into it. Places, everybody. Places.
The Abercast. Occult. History. Conspiracy. Violence.
All right, welcome to the Abercast. I'm your host, John, and before we're going to get right into this, we got a lot to cover. I'm actually going to wind up having to probably bust this up into 2 pieces, but we're going to see how it goes. We're going to see how fast I can fly through it. Before we get started, I just want to say Libra 3 challenge rules apply. There will be no fake coughing and no burping into the microphone. If so, I'm going to get a slash. You can check out Instagram to see my 4 luscious gashes from last episode. So there you go. Libra 3 challenges apply. I'd like to encourage everyone to rate and review the show on iTunes. I'd like to invite everyone to the stigmatastudios.com or abercast.com. Check out the website. You can find links to all my social media down at the bottom. They're pretty fantastic. And I'm loving to hear from you guys. I heard from a couple listeners this week, and it's good stuff. Patreon, you can find me on Patreon. That actually, if I do 2 episodes, if this breaks down into 2 episodes, I'll probably throw the second episode on Patreon for a week or 2. So just if you're interested, and I'm going to tell you, this is a fascinating topic. It's Patreon / what Abercast. I'm sure you can find it. I don't even have it in the show note. I don't know why. Anyhow, the point of the Patreon page right now is, besides trying to get a good reason, trying to get an excuse to get some Abercast mason jars printed up with the oath on them, and some T-shirts with the oath on them, and some other stuff. The main goal right now is it's a work in progress, and there's going to be a bunch of different steps and everything. But the main thing is I want to get a Books for Soldiers Deployed Overseas program. I'm tied into 2 programs right now. It's just a matter of, getting books and paying for P.O. boxes and shipping. Shipping is the big thing. So check it out. I got some fun stuff I'm planning over there. Not a whole lot's going on over there just yet, but I'm anxious. I'm ready to get going. So I need your help. I guess that's one. God damn it. I didn't choose a place to do it today. This one right here. This will do it. Actually, I had a listener to call me out, telling me my slashes weren't enough. But according to the practice, it's a razor blade to the forearm. So I feel like I've covered that. Anyhow, okay, so let's go. So if you've listened to the show before, you'll be able to figure out that one of my pet topics or whatever themes is the Vietnam War. It's come up a few times. I think the first time it really became relevant to the podcast was the RFK episode, when I talked about the Kennedys assassinating DM, and then the William Colby episode, and certainly the Pentagon Papers episode. There's probably a few more thrown in there I'm just not thinking of right now. I would urge you to revisit the RFK episode specifically to refresh your memory on why we had to invest so much blood and so many boots in Vietnam, specifically the Kennedy administration's coup and assassination of DM, like I already mentioned. Also, specifically to at least the end episode, I would urge you to go back and listen to the Pentagon Papers episode, specifically the part about the Paris Peace Accords and ultimately why we lost winning the Vietnam War, because that's kind of where we're gonna jump off from right here. Okay, well, yeah, all right. So this is the part where you guys turn the lights down a little bit. I mean, not if you're at work, you don't want to do that, or if you're listening to the show at the gym or whatever, but this is where you want to get your mason jar, and if you go to the patreon.com/Abercast, you can, in a little bit, we'll have some Abercast mason jars you can mix it up in, but mix up your Jin Jihad and, get ready to travel with me to the early 70s, to the tail end of the Vietnam War, because that's where we're going. Tonight we're going to be talking about the missing POWs of Vietnam. And so when, of course, like, I'm older than most of you guys, I would bet. But I grew up watching movies like Rambo and Missing in Action and Uncommon Valor, which is actually going to come up, I think, in this episode, specifically Uncommon Valor. So I grew up watching these movies, and I guess there was a part of me that just took it as, yeah, everybody knows these prisoners of war are over there, before I knew much of anything. So, what was I thinking? Oh, hold on. I gotta just get in here and do this. That was a fake cough, I think. All right. Okay, so before I knew much of anything, I just assumed that the whole world knew that there were American POWs left in Vietnam. And I guess I didn't think a whole lot about, it's shitty. Like, I didn't think seriously about it until, I was in the Army, and I read this book. We're going to talk about this book later. It's called Kiss the Boys Goodbye. And it had a lot, it was all about this stuff that we're going to be talking about tonight. So that's kind of where I got into it, but I don't want to talk too much about the book because it's pretty controversial, and a lot of people say that a lot of the parts of the book have been discredited. This is why I've kind of gone back and found a bunch of, the Chicago Tribune. Not a whole bunch of people are going to argue that was fake news at the time. I found stuff from the Washington Post in the 90s and whatnot. That's kind of what we're going to be going off of. So let's get started. Let's get rolling right into this. Tail end of the Vietnam War. All right. So part of the Paris Accords, these are the accords that Nixon signed, basically affecting the surrender of the communist Vietnamese. Part of the deal for this Vietnamese surrender was funds set aside for the purpose of rebuilding the country post-war. The dollar amount rang in at about $1.3 billion. Now, as we know from the Pentagon Paper episode, once the commie Vietnamese surrendered, the Democrats in Congress refused to honor the agreements or the conditions of these peace accords. So, I guess I'm going to learn to quit doing it. I'm going to have to. Okay, 591 American POWs were returned in what was called Operation Homecoming. The U.S. listed about 2,500 American POWs. 1,200 Americans were labeled as KIA-NBR. That's killed in action, no body recovered. Many of these were airmen shot down over northern Vietnam and Laos. So the discrepancy in the numbers led to a lot of speculation and investigation, and it has contributed to a theory that a significant number of missing U.S. soldiers from the Vietnamese conflict were captured by communist forces and kept alive as prisoners even after the U.S. involvement in the war that the war concluded in 1973. Now, that was right from Wikipedia, because it was a pretty succinct way to say it, so I just took it. So we're going to do a time jump here from 73 to December 25th, 1991. That's the day that the Soviet Union collapses. Gorbachev resigns, leaving Boris Yeltsin as the president of Russia. So that's going to introduce our first read right here. Hold on. The article is called U.S. Baffled by Yeltsin's POW Disclosure. This was in the Washington Post by a guy named John Lancaster, June 17th, 1992. U.S. officials yesterday reacted with bafflement and curiosity to the Russian President Boris Yeltsin's disclosure that U.S. servicemen captured in the Vietnam War may have been secretly held by the Soviet Union. The possibility that U.S. soldiers were taken to the Soviet Union and may even still be alive, quote, does not square with what we thought we knew, unquote, said retired Army General John W. Vesey Jr., Special Presidential Envoy to Vietnam for POW MIAs. It's absolutely new information. Yeltsin made this disclosure in an interview with NBC News Monday, as apparently reiterated yesterday in a meeting with President Bush. This is Bush Sr., obviously, at the White House. Yeltsin had said to offer any evidence for the claim, and following Monday's news report, the senior Russian member of a joint U.S.-Soviet commission on POW MIA issues expressed some surprise at the Russian president's remark. Now, it says that he did this, that he said this during an interview, but actually he was being talked to on his airplane on the way over. And on the way over, the guy so I guess it was an interview, but I mean, it wasn't like, he wasn't sitting, in CBS headquarters or whatever. He was on his airplane. So he said it, and he just kept saying it the whole time while his trip was here. I actually think they're going to say that. Nevertheless, while administration officials were skeptical, Bush yesterday promised to dispatch immediately to Moscow members of the U.S.-Russian Commission to follow up on Yeltsin's tip. On his tip. Just the tip. Yeltsin's comment to Bush followed a remarkable series of disclosures from the Russian president, not just about possible Soviet complicity in the disappearance of U.S. servicemen in Vietnam, but throughout the Cold War. Last week, Yeltsin said in a letter to the Senate Select Committee on POW MIA Affairs that the Soviets had kept 12 Americans shot down on spy missions over the Soviet territory in the 50s in prison in psychiatric hospitals. So that's something that we're going to see, especially in the tail end of either the tail end of this episode or the next episode, however it winds up shaking out, is this psychiatric hospital idea. The administration officials have, for the most part, discounted persistent rumors that U.S. soldiers have been held in Vietnam or the Soviet Union over 4 years after the end of the war. But the issue has been kept alive by some POW MIA advocates, several of whom have already seized on Yeltsin's disclosure as vindication of their long-held beliefs that the U.S. government ignored or suppressed, more on this, evidence that American prisoners may still be alive. The article continues. The confusion over the fate of the American POWs in Russia reflected the protracted and torturous process of declassifying hundreds of millions of formerly top-secret documents and archives belonging to the Soviet Communist Party and KGB security police. While Yeltsin's administration officials have made a number of startling allegations, including the claim that former Soviet regime had widespread contacts with terrorists, release of documents have been partial and very selective. Establishing what happened to every person who passed through the system of Stalinist prison camps, known as the Gulag, is virtually impossible given the huge numbers involved and the lack of computer records. Russian presidential spokesperson, here we go, Vyacheslav Kostelov told reporters yesterday that a start had been made on identifying individual graves of U.S. servicemen. So that's fucking depressing. So after this, several congressional investigations have looked into these issues, accumulating with the largest and most thorough. The United States Senate Select Committee on POW MIA Affairs that went from 91 to 93, led by favorites, led by the greatest hits by Senators John Kerry, who is a Vietnam veteran. They'll always tell you. Bob Smith, I don't know him. And, of course, John McCain, who is a Vietnam veteran that they will tell you he's also a POW. It found, quote, no compelling evidence that proves that any Americans remain alive in captivity in Southwest Asia, unquote. So at the face of that, I look at it and I'm like, yeah, okay. All right. Now, there's been like dozens, if not hundreds, of maps. So these pilots and stuff, mainly the pilots, were given like a 4 or 5 digit code that was specific to them. So if they were to get shot down, they were supposed to like carve these letters into the ground or whatever to identify them, so we at least knew what area they were in. You know, because while we were flying spy plane missions, and dozens, if not hundreds, of these things have been found. And when you listen to these committees, they're like, "Oh no, just these Korean kids just built this 5-digit code into the into their lawns and stuff." Like, that's obviously not meant to be a V or a K or whatever. So there's tons of evidence out there of this. But when you look at it through the lens of we're going to be looking at it, there's no compelling evidence to prove that any Americans remain alive in captivity in South Asia. Well, that's something altogether, isn't it? Because we're going to be talking about where they went after the war, and it wasn't home, and they didn't keep them there in South Asia. Okay, so at this point in time, we kind of have to talk about Ross Perot. And some of you younger people are probably like, who is Ross Perot? And I'm going to tell you, it's just going to be quick. I'm not going to get into a big in-depth bio. This is the biography channel's profile of Ross Perot. It's not going to be like that. All right, so Ross Perot was just, he was this Texas oil man. He is. I think he's still alive. He's this Texas oil man who became obsessed with the idea that these POW MIAs were lost in Vietnam somewhere. They were left behind. He quite famously ran for president in 92 and 96. People would say against Bill Clinton, but he was actually running against the first Bush. And then I guess in 96 he was running against Clinton. But anyhow, he's the whole reason that Clinton got the presidency. Ross Perot ran as an independent, and he wound up getting like 18 to 20% of the Republican votes going towards him. And like Bush didn't do himself any favors when he did the whole read my lips, no new taxes. So a lot of the Republicans were voting for Ross Perot, who was running, a similar profile. I mean, being a Texas oil man and all of this good stuff. But literally, like when people are like, this Clinton machine is like, it's running fast and it's running clean. He never really got above 50% of the votes because this super rich independent was running. So he was actually siphoning votes off of both sides. When you actually look at the mathematical breakdown, Clinton never got over 50% of the vote either time when he ran or when he ran for election. It had a lot to do with his Ross Perot. So there's a lot to be said about this, because I know we just got off of this, well, in the past, we've done this, the Clinton crime stories with Mena, Arkansas and all this, and we just did an episode on the Clinton machine in the hashtag Me Too movement. But so this is fascinating because Ross Perot wound up sending his own like mercenaries to Vietnam to look for POWs. And this is what the movie Uncommon Valor was actually based on. Now, I didn't know any of this. I watched Uncommon Valor when I was a young man in the service. And I was like, wow, man, that guy really had his shit together. Well, it took, a long time before I realized that the Gene Hackman character was based on Ross Perot. And he hired this mercenary or this soldier of fortune or this patriot, however he painted himself as, before and after. And I mean, we might have talked about Bo Gritz before, but we sent him over there. So now Bo Gritz gets to say that the character of Rambo was based on him. So, I mean, there's a lot of bullshit floating around about this. But Perot did send some like mercenary, some soldier of fortune types over to find POWs. And what I think happened is I think that they didn't find POWs, but I think they found evidence that the CIA was smuggling drugs. And I think that's why Perot was gunning for Bush Sr. so hard. So, Uncommon Valor, Rambo, etc. During the Bush senior years, he became hyperactive, and I think the reason that he did this was because he understood that Bush was running these drugs. Okay, so with that being said, we're going to jump to our next read here, which is Why Perot Was Right About America's Missing Soldiers. This is 92. July 12th, 1992. Yeah, which is just after the first thing. This is just after the piece in the Washington Post ran by John Lancaster about Yeltsin. So John Toombs, July 12th, 1992, in the Washington Post runs a article, Why Perot Was Right About America's Missing Soldiers. On April 8th, 1987, Ross Perot reported on his 9-month special investigation to the POW MIA issue in a recently disclosed letter to President Reagan. His findings, quote, we left POWs behind at the end of the war in Vietnam, unquote. His second finding, we knew we were leaving men behind. His third finding, the men we left behind were held in Laos. Although Perot's unconventional presidential campaign, the media has frequently pointed out his involvement in the POW MIA issue as evidenced in an obsessive and conspiratorial mindset, but his characterizations increasingly rings hollow. Senator John Kerry, D. Mass, Vietnam vet, chairman of the Senate Select Committee on POW MIA Affairs, said recently that the information he has seen, quote, contradicts official statements repeated for almost 2 decades. After Russian President Boris Yeltsin's statement that U.S. prisoners from Vietnam were relocated to his country and may still be alive, one White House source told me, quote, looks like Perot's been vindicated, unquote. The article goes on to say there was a POW MIA report by Senator Jesse Helms, Republican, North Carolina. The Helms report shows signs of shoddy research, such as mistaking a 1973 report of 5,000 prisoners in North Vietnamese hands as including only Americans when the number included South Vietnamese. But like Perot, Helms staff had access to classified documents, and the Stevensons have studied this issue for years. Monica Stevens, that was a real cough, I assure you, began looking into, as a producer of CBS's 60 Minutes, her husband in Indochina Hand was no stranger to the intelligence world. Moreover, Helms documented the pattern of U.S. government neglect of American POWs back to World War I. And however anecdotal, the evidence in the Stevenson's book is extensive. Another book, Nigel Cawthorne's, this Stevenson's that he's talking about is, I believe they're talking about the book that I started the show talking about, which is Kiss the Boys Goodbye. I think that's what they're talking about. Anyhow, Nigel Cawthorne's The Bamboo Cage, published in London last year, sifted 15 volumes of declassified intelligence documents and can be found in the Library of Congress. He found evidence he terms, quote, a mile high, unquote, that Americans were left behind and, quote, abundant evidence that some were alive in 1990. Perot's involvement dates to 1969 when he tried to take Christmas parcels to prisoners in Hanoi and took POW MIA family members to Paris to lobby North Vietnamese officials. He championed the attempt Sun Tay prison camp rescue in 70, and in 74 sent the raid's leader, Colonel Arthur Bull Simmons, to Laos in an unsuccessful attempt to locate Americans there. The U.S. government also remained interested in the Joint Chiefs of Staff planned a reconnaissance and rescue mission in Laos for spring of 81, but it was aborted after the reconnaissance mission failed. Prior to the raid, Perot reactivated his involvement, and he became linked to a planned and thwarted rescue mission led by James Bo Gritz. It is not clear if Perot did more than reimburse Gritz for a plane ticket. When Reagan appointed Perot to his Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board in 82, the businessman used a post to probe further into POW MIA information, according to White House staffer. It goes on to say, Perot, whom Reagan had authorized as a special investigator on the issue with access to classified documents, told the subcommittee, the evidence is overwhelming that people are there. I don't know how you define a cover-up, but if you look at the standards we require to show you that there is one live American still in Vietnam or Laos, and compare that to what we sent home in caskets, we've got a double standard. The subsequent recommendations for more energetic and flexible U.S. policy to learn went nowhere. He goes on to say, the Stevensons relate how Perot once told then Vice President Bush, I go looking for prisoners, but I can't get the prisoners because of the corruption among our own covert people. Although Perot's access to classified material was later cut off, he continued to probe. Feelers from Hanoi led him to believe that the Vietnamese wanted to deal. He proposed several schemes to build a relationship. The administration rejected them. Meanwhile, in 87, Reagan sent General John W. Vesey Jr. to Hanoi to begin the protracted negotiations that eventually led to our current situation. Oh, that's interesting. With several, keep that in mind. I'm going to read it again, but not because I think you're stupid or whatever, just because I just got blindsided by this little piece of information that's going to become relevant later. Meanwhile, in July 87, Reagan sent John W. Vesey Jr. to Hanoi to begin the protracted negotiations that eventually led to our current situation. This was written in 92. So remember that later. With several dozen Americans in Vietnam inspecting crash sites and pursuing various live sighting reports. Hold on, I just gotta skip to find the rest of this article. Hold on. Skeptics point out that no missing American except for alleged collaborator Bobby Garwood has ever come back alive. H. Bruce Franklin, author of MIA Myth-Making in America, calls the notion of surviving MIA POWs, quote, an elaborate fraud, unquote. But thanks to Perot and others who have stayed with the issue, many Americans now believe there is more to be learned about the fate of the American soldiers in Indochina. All right, what do you guys think? What do you guys think of this? At this point, do you believe there were soldiers left behind? Airmen, whoever, U.S. Military personnel were left behind? I'm curious to see what you think about this. We're actually going to do this. We're going to do it all in one gigantic episode. I'm ready to go. I am ready to go. This is probably going to be a great time to do the mid-roll. Roll up, roll out, stop, drop, and mid-roll. right, so now we're going to move into part 2 of this, which is I had decided to call the medical experiments. So this is part 2, obviously. Okay, so let's go. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Russian President Boris Yeltsin opens this Soviet Union secret archives to Western historians. There's an Australian historian named Stephen Morris who's digging around in the secret military intelligence files, and he finds this report of a speech made by Vietnamese General Tran Pan Quang. At the end of the document, there is a big section on POWs, and it is talking about this number, 1,205 American prisoners of war. But the document goes on to say that they've only confirmed to America that they have 368 POWs. So this Australian makes a copy of this document and he smuggles it to the United States. Now the story gets a little dodgy here because it says he gives the document to, quote, the administration and asks them to keep it confidential. So I don't know what that means. I don't know, like, he doesn't just roll up to the White House, so it doesn't exactly say the mechanism of which he passed this off and how he tried to make it confidential. But they go on to say that the reaction was immediate. Morris, this guy, found himself under investigation, and this is something that goes... Ironically, it's a theme shared with last episode where these people that are trying to help Clinton out or whatever just get investigated. This guy's family, his friend, his work, they all get just bombarded. They want to know who's paying this guy. Where is he getting his money from? I think he said that he was actually working, or he was a professor or some teaching staff at some point, at some degree, at Berkeley. So, I mean, this guy's being investigated. They want to know who's paying him, who's whatever. They're calling the U.S. government, like the FBI is calling Berkeley, asking about this guy, which you'd think that would be, if you're working at Berkeley, that would be like a career enhancing booster. But this guy got bugged out. So he actually turned around and he released these documents to the newspapers. And predictably, the military and the intelligence community pushed back. And their big bone of contention was it must be a forgery because it conflicts with all of our intelligence reports. Which, I mean, that's mind-blowing. So why? Why this stonewall? Why ignore this document? Why ignore the president of Russia who's telling you we had POWs from Vietnam in Russia? And here's the main reason. Whoa. That's wrong. Sorry about that. So here's the main reason, and you're gonna recognize this right off the bat. It's politics. Okay, so I'm reading a thing here. I think it's from '93. It's by a guy named Douglas Gell from the New York Times. Opening to Vietnam, Clinton drops a 19-year ban on U.S. trade with Vietnam, cites Hanoi's help on MIAs. President Clinton today ordered an end to the trade embargo on Vietnam, casting away a central remnant of one of America's most decisive wars and opening a potentially lucrative market to American goods. After nearly 2 decades of bitter peace, Mr. Clinton said that it was now time to acknowledge the cooperation Vietnam has shown in the search for evidence of the 2,238 Americans still officially listed as missing from that conflict, which ended in '75. America, this is wrong. America's role in the war was ended in 1973 by the Paris Accords. If you listen to the podcast, you would know this. He said opening the door to trade would benefit that still unfinished search. At the White House ceremony this afternoon, Mr. Clinton said he was lifting the trade embargo because, quote, because I'm absolutely convinced it offers us the best way to resolve the fate of those who remain missing and about whom we are not sure. Allowing a liaison officer, Mike Clinton, is terrible. The steps taken by Mr. Clinton stop short of restoring diplomatic relations with Vietnam, but it will allow the United States and Vietnam each to open a liaison office in the other's capital and the highest level of ties between them in their long and painful war that left more than 58,000 Americans dead before the United States withdrew from the conflict in 1973. See, I told you. The United States informed Vietnam the decision this afternoon, and the White House said the trade between two countries would resume as soon as the Commerce Department could draft the necessary regulations, probably within the next several weeks. It goes on to say, since July alone, Vietnam has returned to the United States the remains of 39 individuals believed to be American personnel, bringing to 67 the number of sets of remains handed over in 1993. Only 3 of those sets so far have been conclusively identified, and the remains of the United States servicemen. Vietnam has also provided new help in investigating the claims of live sightings of missing Americans and sharing wartime documents. Mr. Clinton, who eased some some sanctions against Vietnam on 2 occasions last year, but refused to lift the embargo, said today that the progress met the condition he had set forth for the restoration of trade. Without fully explaining his reasoning, he said that he had to conclude that to an end to the embargo represented, quote, the best way to continue getting information about those Americans who are still missing. It goes on to say the officials are also strongly rejected characterizations that the step represented a reward for Vietnamese cooperation and spoke with some lingering bitterness at the briefing today of the years of which Vietnam had confounded rather than helped the American search for the missing. Mr. Clinton, who took extraordinary steps to avoid the military service in Vietnam, was in the odd position today as Commander-in-Chief of marking an end of sorts to a war in which he, unlike many of his contemporaries, did not take part. But he insisted today that the decision had not been complicated by that fact. You can go back and listen to my Clinton Crime Stories episode to get a little bit of insight into what those extraordinary steps were. All right, so I asked you this a little bit ago, but now where are you at? Like, where do you think that there was men left behind? Do you think there were men intentionally left behind? If so, where are they? What happened to them? Where did they go? Because I'm going to take you on a little trip through time. Okay, we're going to go forwards in time to talk about something that happened backwards in time. So this article was written, I believe this is the Chicago Tribune, September 18th, 1996, by Bob Kemper of the Washington Bureau. The article is titled Defector Details Korea POW Atrocities. GIs reported to be used in Soviet experiments. Washington, amid reports that the U.S. government may have knowingly left hundreds of American servicemen behind enemy lines after the Korean War. Okay, so we're talking about 2 different wars, but hold on, it makes sense later. A high-ranking Czech defector alleged Tuesday that some of the Americans were subjected to Nazi-style medical torture during their captivity. Czech and Soviet doctors, directed by Moscow, used hundreds of prisoners of war to test mind-altering drugs, chemical, and biological weapons to sharpen their own medical skills. said Jan Sejna, a former Czech general and top communist official who now works for the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency, in testimony before House Committee. It goes on to say, quote, all of these things were scientifically orchestrated, unquote, said Sejna, who testified that he helped ship, quote, the human guinea pigs, unquote, from the war zone to the Soviet Union. Sejna's allegations that the latest in a series of recent reports of supposed sightings of American POWs inside North Korea described a secret world of horrors inflicted on the now aged veterans of the Korean War. He also alleged that the American POWs captured during the Vietnam War were subject to Soviet medical experiments. It goes on to say, the essence of Sejna's story, which has circulated inside the U.S. Intelligence Committee for years, has been disclosed in the news media in recent days, helping to reignite controversy over whether Americans were still being held against their will in North Korea and Vietnam, despite the formal denials of both countries. Naval Reserve Commander William Beck, another analyst from the POW office, said that, quote, whatever the numbers, 200, 400, 900, I believe in my heart that American POWs were transferred to the Soviet Union from Korea. In Vietnam, I think some POWs were transferred to the Soviet Union, close quote. Many of these prisoners, Sejna said, were subjected to medical experiments at a hospital in the Czechs built explicitly for the purpose in North Korea on the orders of Soviet military intelligence. After the war, at least 100 prisoners were transported through Czechoslovakia to the Soviet Union, where experiments continued. Sejna said that he also saw, quote, at least 200 U.S. prisoners captured in the Vietnam and Laos, transported to the Soviet Union between 1961 and 68, just before he defected. Some of these soldiers, he said, were given to the Chinese for similar medical experiments. During the experiments, the prisoners often were divided by race, rank, and educational level to determine whether those factors altered their reaction to various situations and poisons. According to Sejna, the officials from the Pentagon POW office, data gathered from these experiments, Sejna would help the Soviets plot how to combat American forces in future wars. All right, so I guess that's where we're going to draw the line. I still have a bunch to read, but it gets pretty gruesome. So this is like the little wall I'm going to build. So we're going to go ahead and end the show here, and then if you guys stick around to it's basically the after credit scene. I'll get into this article I found from 97 from Hacienda Publishing. They're a publishing company that deals a lot with medical and medical ethics. So I would like to encourage everyone to rate and review the show on iTunes. First of all, tell me what you think. What do you think about all this? Do you think that American Vietnam POWs were shipped to the Soviet Union for gruesome medical experimentations? That's terrifying and crazy. And terrifying. And the fact that we knew about it it's even more crazier. So I want to know what you guys think about all that stuff, and I want to encourage you guys to rate and review in the show. And have you ever heard of this conspiracy before? Have you heard of it like in your conspiracy life? Is this something that's on your radar, or were on your radar? Was on your radar? I don't know. I'd like to encourage you guys to check out stigmatastudios.com or abercast.com. They kind of go to the same spot. But my social media links are at the bottom of that, and I would ask you guys to look me up and let me know what you think about this episode and this conspiracy, and what you think about this idea that these American fighting men and pilots are shipped over to the Soviet Union to be made medical experiments of. It's a crazy situation. And then also, is it also, or is that it? Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Abercast and find me. My main goal right now is to get some Books for Soldiers programs lined up. Want to send some stuff to some soldiers who need some reading material and help make America weird again. So we're going to wrap this up, but hang in for after these ads, and then we'll get to the meat and potatoes of this experimentation issue. This episode is far from over, my friends. If you got the guts, you got the guts. Zicka-wicka-wee. Zicka-wicka-wee.
Vienna, 1683. Today is September 11th, 1683. The mighty army of the Ottoman Empire, led by the savage and radical terror troops of the Dar al-Harb, surround the walled city of Vienna and begin a siege to break the golden apple of Europe and kill, enslave, or convert all of its inhabitants. The valiant citizens stand against the tyrannical army with the steadfast leadership of Count Ernst Rudiger von Stromberg, the help of the ever-living rebel Cyrus the Dead Guy, and the hopes of the faraway King Jan Sobieski III and his army of flying hussars. The Vienna 1683 comic is available right now from Stigmata Studios at stigmatastudios.com and on indieplanet.us. The Non-Standard Squad, 1944. World War II. 3 weird American soldiers are on a search and rescue mission into the oldest and darkest regions of Europe. A cursed ever-living warrior, Cyrus the Dead Guy. An experimental warbot, Sergeant Lane McCord. An all-red axe, mysterious rogue with a demon-possessed arm, come face to face with an army of magically corrupted machine-obsessed elves, a magic hammer-wielding Norse Ubermensch, and a Nazi wizard who is a member of the ancient Dark Order of the Shining Hexagon. The Non-Standard Squad 1944 comic is available right now from Stigmata Studios at stigmatastudios.com and on indieplanet.us.
Thanks for hanging in there. I appreciate it. So we're going to get into this last article I got. It's called The Communist Use of American POWs as Human Guinea Pigs, Part 2. Vietnam, the Soviets, and other special projects. So Part 1 dealt with the beginning of this program and Korean POWs. This was written by Russell L. Blaylock, MD, for the fall issue of Hacienda Publishing, which, from what I understand, is they used to run some magazines or whatever in the 90s and the 2000s, and they focused in on medical issues, medical ethics, that kind of stuff. So this guy, Dr. Blaylock, starts out. When the American POWs returned from captivity in Vietnam, military authorities noticed there were no amputees. At the time, this puzzled experts. With over 2,000 men in captivity, one would expect at least a few amputees. But the light of what is known about the Soviet human experimentation program, it now makes a lot more sense. Most likely, these men were used either for military experiments or for training young surgeons. This takes us right back to that article about General Sejna. he mentions training surgeons. As in North Korea, once the procedures were completed, the experimental subjects were killed and their bodies were incinerated. This long article goes on to say, in a conversation with Dr. Joseph Douglas, I learned that the majority of the world's drug trade is still run by the Soviet KGB apparatus. Having gained much experience in operating a top-secret program utilizing American POWs as human test subjects, the Soviets moved to their next stage in their experimentation test programs as the Vietnam War expanded. This new section is called the Vietnam POW MIAs used as medical guinea pigs. According to General Sejna, the Vietnam program began in 1960 when the North Vietnamese Chief of General Staff and 10 senior officers visited Prague and Moscow in search for military assistance. It was during one of these particular sensitive meetings that General Alexander Khrushchev, a Soviet advisor, explained to the group that American POWs had been used in medical experimentation during the Korean War, and they expected more American POWs in exchange for their military support of the Vietnam War efforts. Why were Americans so prized as experimental subjects when the Soviets had easy access to millions of their own citizens and thousands of South Korean POWs? Not only because the Americans were seen as the, quote, main enemy, unquote, but also that the Americans were from a completely different culture and would react to stress in a wholly different way. They needed to understand the Western mind if they were going to develop methods to alter their enemy's ability to think, plan, and function in a war situation. Oh my God. This is terrifying. Early in the Soviet Vietnamese meetings, it was suggested that the POWs be divided into two groups immediately upon their capture: the regular POW population and a second special group to be used in medical experimentation. These two groups were not to be kept separate at all, or were to be kept separate at all times. Specific plans were drawn up by each of the Soviet, Czech, and Vietnamese military counterintelligence officers for the securement of American POWs to be shipped to the Soviet Union. We go on to say, within 6 months, the plan was completed. Soviet military intelligence was in charge of the overall operation. The plan further specified that the selection of POWs to be used in the medical experimentation would be made as soon as they were captured, and that the Soviets would identify the number of, quote, specimens, unquote, that they desired. Such decisions were based on race, age, and rank. While younger soldiers were desired for most experiments, they were special experiments that called for older POWs. For example, they used the older officers to test the mind control drugs because they were known to be more, quote, reactionary, unquote. That is, that they were more likely to try to resist the interrogators' attempts to extract information. They are also appreciated that the fact that the officers were better able to deal with stress and did so differently from the enlisted man. He goes on to say the pilot plan was put in operation in 1961, and the Soviet request for American specimens were included men of all ages and races. The first shipment of Americans arrived in Prague in August and included approximately 6 or 7 Americans. They were housed in the military intelligence villa following a 2-day examination and were shipped by airplane to the Soviet Union. According to Sejna, this shipment contained a larger amount of older Americans. The shipment arrived in the Vietnamese Deputy Chief of General Staff for Military Intelligence, General Major Quang. The second shipment, according to Sejna, came in the spring of 1962. and the third in November or December of 62, a large shipment arrived. In 63, carrying some 20 to 25 Americans. One of the prize types of specimens was the U.S. pilots, since they were not only possessed of vital information concerning war plans, but also classified information on U.S. technology in general. The Czechs were instructed by Moscow to expand their interrogation drug testing program and to be prepared to utilize new supplies of American POWs from the war in Southeast Asia. The Soviet program swings into full operation. Towards the end of 63, after the signing of the Soviet North Vietnamese agreement, the POW program reached its full potential. It is known that Khrushchev himself approved the program based on a letter and discussion in which he explicitly stated that the American soldiers had been most useful in the past and that they were many chemical and biological warfare agents that still needed to be tested on human subjects. Ugh. The agreement with the Vietnamese stressed that the selection of POWs would be a joint Soviet-Vietnamese effort. Sorry, bros, I just need to get a drink. This is some dark shit. The North Vietnamese wanted to turn American POWs manipulated by mind-altering drugs into a spy network that could be returned to the United States to work on their behalf. This is the Manchurian Candidate. The Soviet rejected this plan since they felt they were perfectly able to recruit spies from American military personnel on R&R in South Vietnam and Australia. Sejna states that comments made to him by East German Minister of Defense General Heinz Hoffmann, well, if that isn't a German name, I do declare, indicated that the new experiments were highly successful. He stated that these drugs were being tested on the Americans were, quote, 1,000% more effective than the physical means of persuasion, unquote. Testimony from American POWs being held in the general population can attest to the efficiency of the East German inquisitors using conventional techniques of torture. We have ways to make you talk. There is also evidence that at least some of these, quote, interrogation drugs, unquote, were used on POWs in the general population. Article goes on to say Sejna affirms that 15 Czech doctors and 8 scientists from the Czech Academy of Sciences were involved in the research using POWs within the Soviet Union, and was known that many East German doctors and scientists were also formed into project teams. These were roughly 20 different highly secret research institutes scattered through the Soviet Union, utilizing American POWs for their gruesome experiments. The Special Institute was built in Moscow solely to test chemical warfare and biological warfare agents against human test subjects, many of which were Americans. The experiments. In the original plan outlined by Moscow, 7 separate objects were to be initiated. Projects. That makes more sense. 7 separate projects were to be initiated. These included various experiments on mind control drugs, chemical warfare, biological warfare agents, ionizing radiation experiments, experiments on stress, development and testing of narcotics, and surgical training of young surgeons. The biological warfare experiments included tests of agents known to have no cure. Various experimental treatments were to be carried out on American captives in hopes of developing a way to inactivate bacterial or viral agents in Soviet soldiers. This would be invaluable in the battlefield as well in certain instances of sabotage. American soldiers were injected with live cultures of bacteria, viruses to test the speed of, the degree of incapacitation, death rates, and pathological effects on various organs. Another line of research was the development and testing of assassination agents. Two types of chemical weapons and biological weapon agents were developed in the Soviet bloc for those, quote, wet operations, unquote, for use of measures by such as assassins, and those used in sabotage or Spetsnaz operations or political or military reasons. Both types of agents were tested on American POWs. One particular area of interest of the Soviets included creating chemical warfare agent that would penetrate protective suit and mask. The Presidential Chemical Warfare Review Commission of 1985 was convinced that the Soviets had been successful. Few appreciated the fact that it was the fate of the American POW to prove the success of the Soviet program. Oh, that's terrible. God damn it. Alright, so I want to quit, but I got to keep going. This is that they render the soldier unable to carry out his military function without leading to or need of his replacement. Some of these agents cause confusion, disorientation, difficulty with recent memory, or other cognitive dysfunction. Special agents designed to induce a state of intense fear have been tested as well. It is entirely possible that the Soviets used such experimental agents in the Gulf War, and they could have been introduced to the food or water supply, or used as an aerosol that, as we've seen, could penetrate the protective gear used by soldiers. As well as documented, the Soviets used chemical agents in Afghanistan and in South Asia, the, quote, yellow rain. There were several reports of Soviet technicians in protective gear entering battle, blah, blah, blah. Special projects. Many cases, the Soviets concluded special operations on such project involved the use of electromagnetism. Late in the spring of 1967, the Soviets stressed the importance of such research to the chief of the Science Administration and Czech Ministry of Defense, with special emphasis on the psychological and physical effects. 10 years later, the Soviets were actually caught using this against American embassy personnel in Moscow. It was revealed that they deliberately bombarded American personnel with low-level microwave radiation for at least 10 years. Many of the officials became ill and reportedly difficult with the recent memory and fatigue, and several developed bone marrow change. This just happened at a Chinese embassy. The same thing just happened. It just happened at an embassy in China. Look it up. Just fucking look it up. All right. It is known that yada yada yada. It'll go skip to the end. It is known that the Soviets were interested in using mind-controlled drugs against diplomats, attaches, foreign technicians, emigres and defectors, politicians in foreign countries, and to incapacitate large populations prior to an invasion. It is well known that the Soviet psychiatrists used mind-control drugs to impede judgment, alter thinking, and recent memory, and eventually to produce permanent mental derangement among normal political inmates. Huh. Sounds like Democrats. Okay, so that's it. I was able to just crunch it and get it through. I left a lot on the table there, so we might revisit this topic at some point. But I did want to get this all done in one episode, and I gotta just pat myself on the shoulder for it. Also, I only had to Liber 3 myself 3 times. So I believe that Crowley would have a field day with that, because the Liber is 3, and I cut myself 3 times, and he was obsessed with numerology. So there you go. Anyhow, I'm John Towers. This has been the Abercast. Visit stigmatastudios.com or abercast.com. Find me on social media. Let me know what you think of this. Is this some dark shit? Do you agree with this? not agree with it. Do you believe it? What do you believe? Do you believe there's still a bunch of 90-year-old guys in tiger cages in Vietnam? Or, I guess the mind benders, what if they're in the Soviet Union? What if they've been released from the gulag and like has assimilated into Russian culture? That's something to think about. When you get into it, that's a reason to not admit that they're there. We hold these guys up as heroes, but what if they just got released and they couldn't get back and they had to assimilate into Russian culture? What if we had to admit that, hey, some of these POWs turned into fucking commies? What if they turned into the proletariat? Imagine, I don't know what the numbers we're talking about. What if a couple hundred names on that Vietnam Wall were have to get buffed out, because we found out that they did some fucking un-American activities while they were got released from the gulag in the USSR. And it's something to think about, man. I'm not saying that as a shady way to talk about these POWs. Obviously I respect the plight and all that stuff. And I honestly don't know where I come in on this at all. If I had to bet, I would bet that they probably got sent to Russia. God, that's terrifying. I don't even know if I want to admit that. Anyhow, this has been the Abercast. I've been John. Maybe if you have anything left in your mason jar, you could pour some out for these poor sons of bitches tonight, and say a little. I'm not going to say. We're not going to advocate prayer, but maybe you want to pour some of your Jin Jihad out and think about these poor bastards and whatever happened to them. Whatever. So, it couldn't hurt. It could help your soul a little bit. All right, let's wrap this up with, Soda Jerk, fucking fight. Here we go. Man, this has been such a downer. Hey, I only got 3.